62 million eyes froze on a single woman's face. A face that carried the defiance of generations and the weight of every courtroom where justice had been delayed, twisted, or quietly buried. The microphones were hot, the cameras unblinking, and 9 black-robed figures sat like immovable stone, their gaze heavy but unreadable. In that silence, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't glance at an aide for reassurance. She looked straight, ahead, as if staring down the very architecture of power. The air inside the chamber felt thick, not with dust, but with history. People watching from their living rooms didn't just see a congresswoman. They saw every citizen who had ever been told to wait, to be patient, to let the process work. She knew the process. She knew how it moved, slow and deliberate, like molasses when it served the powerful, lightning fast when it served their interests. But this was not another hearing where political theater would drown the truth. This was a moment to place facts on the record so deep and so raw that no ruling, no dismissal, no carefully worded opinion could erase them. 9 judges, some of them veterans of decades-long legal wars, some newly elevated with confirmation, votes that tore the Senate down partisan lines, each of them had their own legacy to protect. She knew their names, their writings, the way they had leaned in past arguments, but she also knew their blind spots, and where the laws supposed neutrality had been punctured by the reality of lived experience. She opened with a date, not a speech, because dates are harder to argue with. December 14, 2012. Sandy Hook, 20 children, 6 adults, gunned down in minutes. Then she stacked the years, each one a grave marker in American memory. Charleston, Orlando, Parkland, Uvalde, no adjectives, no theatrics, just names and numbers. It was not the horror she was recounting. It was the failure to act afterward. In each pause, the room seemed to tighten. The chief judge leaned back, eyes hooded, a signal to no one in particular. But she noticed and she pressed on. From violence in schools to the violence embedded in policy itself, voting restrictions in the South that cut turnout in half. Environmental rollbacks that left poor black and brown neighborhoods breathing poison, a criminal justice system where the same crime or a different sentence depending on the shade of the defendant's skin. She wasn't here to argue abstractions. She was here to stitch together the connective tissue that so many officials pretended didn't exist. And then, she did something few witnesses ever dared in that room. She named them, not just the cases, but the authors of opinions that had tilted history in one direction and locked the door behind them. She read passages from dissents that had been ignored, from concurrences that slipped poison into polite legal language. She spoke of Justice Brennan's warnings, Justice Sotomayor's lonely dissents, and of those who, in her words, wrote history in disappearing ink. The judges shifted. Some glanced down at their notes, others met her eyes with that subtle steel that says, "I'm listening, but I'm not moving." Outside the courthouse, the crowd was swelling. Not in chants, but in silence. That made the police officers on the perimeter glance at each other. It wasn't the restless noise of protest. It was the coiled stillness of a public waiting to see if their rights, their dignity, their place in the republic would be decided by 9 strangers in a room they could never enter. She reminded them, and the nation, that the Constitution was not a relic to be polished and displayed, but a living contract that had been broken more times than honored for millions of Americans. A contract, she said, that too often comes with an asterisk. Her voice didn't rise. It sank, pulling every listener closer. Even those who disagreed with her politics could not deny the precision of her argument. And when she shifted to her own story, the first time she watched a jury form its verdict before hearing a single defense witness, the first time she saw a family lose their home not because of debt, but because the bank had misplaced their payment records, the chamber felt different. The robes in front of her weren't just symbols anymore. They were human beings hearing a truth they could not unhear. For 37 uninterrupted minutes, she poured the record with names, dates, votes, rulings, and the human consequences that followed them. No slogans, no applause lines, just the unvarnished ledger of what the law had done and left undone. And then came the pivot, the moment she turned from witness to challenger. She told them this was not a question of ideology, but of courage. Courage to recognize when precedent had become a shield for injustice. courage to admit that the judiciary, cloaked in tradition, was not immune to the same biases and failures it claimed to adjudicate. The chief judge's pen stopped moving. Another judge leaned forward. She didn't need to see their faces to know the weight of her words had landed. The nation was listening, but so were they. What she was about to say next would either fracture the careful decorum of that room or burn it into the record forever. And in that split second before she spoke, every person watching in the room, on TV, on phones held in trembling hands, knew they were witnessing a line being drawn in American history. The line she drew was not in ink, but in the way her voice cut through the oxygen of that room. "You have the power," she said slowly, "to decide if the law is a shield for the people or a fortress against them." The words didn't shout. They landed like a gavel strike, deliberate and final. There was no mistaking who she was speaking to. Not the public gallery, not the reporters scribbling in shorthand, but the 9 whose signatures could redraw the map of justice in this country. She reminded them of Shelby County v. Holder, the ruling that gutted the Voting Rights Act under the banner of outdated data. She recalled the night she watched counties in Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina begin closing polling places within hours of that decision, as if the ruling were an invitation rather than an interpretation. Preclearance was not a burden, she said, it was a promise. One judge adjusted his glasses. Another scribbled something with quick, tense strokes. She knew they would tell themselves they were impartial, above the political storm, insulated by the marble walls and the procedural rules that kept the chaos outside. But Crockett understood better. The storm was already here, and their robes would not keep them dry. She pivoted to Citizens United, the 2010 decision that turned money into speech and corporations into citizens. She laid out the numbers. The billions poured into campaigns. Since the small-town elections swallowed whole by outside money, the policy shifts that followed like clockwork. Her argument was surgical. No emotional pleas, just the ledger of cause and effect. When you redefine speech, she said, you redefine who gets heard and who gets silenced. By now, the chamber felt like a pressure cooker. The chief judge's gaze had sharpened, but his body stayed still. One of the younger judges, appointed less than 3 years ago, leaned back, as if putting distance between himself and the weight of the moment. Crockett was unrelenting. She spoke of the 303 creative case, the ruling that widened the lane for discrimination under the banner of religious liberty. She told the story of a same-sex couple in her district who were turned away by multiple vendors for their wedding, each refusal punctuated with a polite smile and a citation from Scripture. The law, she said, is not meant to bless prejudice, with a legal seal. And then came her most dangerous move. She crossed from history into now. She named bills pending in state legislatures that mirrored those court rulings, tracing a direct pipeline from bench to bill. She cited governors who had bragged about testing the limits of new judicial interpretations. It wasn't an accusation, it was evidence. Some of the judges shifted uncomfortably, not because they didn't know, but because she was pulling the quiet mechanics of influence into daylight. Outside, the crowd had swelled into the thousands. Journalists moved from the press room to the courthouse steps, broadcasting live updates without knowing the full exchange inside. Social media feeds erupted with clipped quotes from her testimony, some taken out of context, others spreading like wildfire in their raw form. Inside, time felt suspended. Crockett's words now moved slower, heavier, as if she knew each one would be replayed for decades. "We are not here," she said, "to debate whether injustice exists. We are here to decide whether you will acknowledge it while you still have the power to act." Her tone didn't waver, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. She recounted the history of judicial intervention. Brown v. Board, Loving v. Virginia, Obergefell v. Hodges, cases where the court had not waited for consensus, but had stepped into the breach because history would not forgive silence. She looked directly at the chief judge as she asked, "Do you believe the Constitution breathes, or do you believe it is a tomb?" That question hung in the air, unanswered, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Somewhere in the back, a cough broke the silence, and it sounded almost sacrilegious. She pressed forward. The next topic was policing, a subject too often flattened into slogans. She spoke of qualified immunity, a doctrine not in the Constitution, but built by the court's own hands. She told of families in her district who had been denied justice not because the facts weren't clear, but because precedent demanded a nearly identical case before the law could recognize their harm. "How many times," she asked, "must the same harm occur before you believe it is real?" The chamber felt smaller now, as though the marble columns themselves were leaning in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her control, over pacing slow enough to sting, sharp enough to cut, kept even her harshest critics from looking away. She began to close her binder, not because she was finished, but because she wanted them to see the gesture. This was not about the papers, the exhibits, the prepared remarks. This was about the human ledger they could not unwrite. She stepped back from the podium, only slightly, as if granting them space to respond. And in that pause, the question became whether any of them would. None did, not yet. But in the stillness that followed, something had shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it. It was in that stillness, that thick, suspended air between the weight of her words and the absence of any reply, that Jasmine Crockett decided silence was not going to be the last sound in that chamber. She stepped forward again, closing the space she had just ceded, her heels echoing off the marble like a metronome for the truth she was about to deliver. "I will not," she said, her voice lower now, more intimate, "leave this room having given you comfort in inaction." The sentence hit differently. This wasn't a plea for justice. It was a declaration that the comfortable middle ground no longer existed. She reached for a case so recent it was still raw in the public mind. Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. She didn't rehearse the legal reasoning. She knew they already knew it. Instead, she recited the aftermath, states where women drove 6 hours for care, where doctors weighed prison sentences against medical necessity, where rape survivors found the law offered no exception and no mercy. She spoke of hospital corridors lined with patients who weren't dying yet, but were told to come back when they were closer. The law, she said, should not make life a condition for death. The judges shifted again, but not in unison. Some hardened their posture, others looked away, as if eye contact might concede agreement. She was undeterred. She linked Dobbs to a century-long pattern decisions that spoke of returning power to the states, when the states had already shown what they would do with it. She reminded them that Plessy v. Ferguson had once been state power, that segregation had been state power, that the poll tax had been state power. Of its people, by now, the younger judges had stopped pretending to take notes. They were listening in real time, their pens still, their hands resting on the bench like anchors. Crockett moved to environmental justice, a subject too often buried in legalese. She spoke of communities in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, where chemical plants were permitted without restraint, where children grew up counting funerals like birthdays. She cited recent rulings that narrowed the reach of the Clean Water Act, explaining how a single redefinition of navigable waters had left entire populations drinking poison. "The law decides," she said, "whether the river is protected, but the river does not wait for the law to drink it." Outside, the crowd had grown restless. News choppers hovered overhead. In the distance, chants began, not loud enough to disrupt the courtroom, but steady, like a drumbeat keeping time with her cadence. Inside, she turned her focus to democracy itself. She brought up Moore v. Harper, the independent state legislature theory that had once threatened to strip courts of their power to review state election laws. She reminded them that even the hint of such unchecked authority had emboldened certain legislatures to write maps so twisted that citizens in majority-minority districts woke up to find their votes cut in half by a pen stroke. "If the people's voice is filtered through a funnel of manipulation," she said, "then it is no longer the people's voice." And then came the moment where her tone shifted again. Less prosecutorial, more personal. She told them about her grandfather, a man who had fought in Korea, returned home in uniform, and been denied the right to vote in his own town because of a literacy test administered by a man who could barely read himself. She told them how he never lived to see the Voting Rights Act signed, and how her own father, years later, had to explain to her as a child why their district always seemed to lose its polling site in the same election years. "I am not here," she said, "because I believe this court is blind. I am here because I know it can see." The words hung there, an accusation wrapped in hope. A single cough broke the tension again, but this time it came from the bench, a subtle tell that the pressure was finding its way into the cracks. She spoke of precedent as a living thing, capable of evolving, but also capable of calcifying into injustice if guarded too fiercely. She warned against the temptation to hide behind the neutrality of text when the application of that text had never been neutral in practice. The Constitution, she said, has been both a sword and a shield. You decide which it will be. In your hands. For a moment, even the court reporter slowed, as if afraid to miss a syllable. She could feel the unspoken question vibrating in the room. What would she say next? And in that pause, she realized the next words would not be about the past or the law at all. They would be about the choice in front of them, right now, in this very room. The choice, she began, is not between left and right, but between courage and convenience. Her voice was steady, almost calm, but there was an edge in it that made the marble walls seem closer. Every person in this chamber knows the law is not an island. It breathes the same air we do. It bends under the same pressures. It can be weaponized in silence as easily as in speech. She paused, not for effect, but because she wanted those words to settle like dust that could not be swept away. Then she brought them to the present. She spoke of the January 6th attack, not in sound bites, but in the language of evidence, the court filings, the grand jury indictments, the public statements that had shifted in tone depending on the audience. She drew a line from the riot's chaos to the quiet legal maneuvers now creeping through lower courts. Challenges to electoral certification processes, attempts to expand partisan control over vote counting. Insurrection, she said, is not only a mob at the gate, it is also a pen at a desk. One judge's brow tightened. Another leaned into his hand as though the weight of what she was saying demanded support. Crockett pressed on. She laid out the constitutional clauses that had been cited in these cases, pointing out how precedent was being contorted to fit ambitions it was never meant to serve. She mentioned how some lower courts had upheld these challenges with reasoning, so Narrett was practically begging for higher review. That higher review, she said, locking eyes with the bench, is you. Outside, the chants had grown louder now, fragments of them carrying into the chamber when the heavy doors opened to admit late arrivals. She didn't look back. If the law becomes a tool for dismantling the republic, she said, then the court is no longer a safeguard. It is an accomplice. She let the sentence stand, not softened, not rephrased. Her next turn was toward economic justice, an issue that rarely drew cameras but shaped every life in her district. She spoke of the court's recent decisions, narrowing the scope of consumer protections, rulings that allowed payday lenders and predatory banks to operate with minimal oversight. She told of a single mother in Dallas who had borrowed $800 to fix her car, only to find herself owing $3,400 a year later. The court's upholding the lender's practices as contractual freedom. Freedom, she said, should not mean the liberty to trap people in cages they cannot see. She pivoted seamlessly to labor rights, recounting how rulings had chipped away at union power, leaving workers to negotiate alone against billion-dollar corporations. The balance of power, she said, is not a natural law. It is a legal choice. In the gallery, a few people shifted uncomfortably, not because they disagreed, but because her words were pulling the invisible machinery of American inequality into sharp relief. Then came the moment she had been moving toward all along, the reminder that every ruling they issued was not just an interpretation, but an instruction to the country. She leaned in slightly, as though confiding something meant for them alone. When you rule, she said, you teach. You teach the police officer what he can get away with. You teach the corporation what it can take. You teach the landlord how far he can push. And you teach the citizen how much faith they should keep in the promise of justice. There was no rebuttal to that in the moment, just the sound of the court reporter's keys and the faint hum of cameras outside. Crockett could feel the shift now. This was no longer a recitation of grievances or a parade of historical wounds. This was an indictment of complacency itself. And yet, she did not shout. She didn't need to. The power was in the quiet certainty of her voice, the kind that made people lean in, not pull back. History, she said finally, will remember you, not for the cases you cite, but for the people who will live or die by what you decide. For a heartbeat, the room seemed frozen, the judges as still as the statues flanking the chamber. Then one of them, not the chief, but a mid-ranking voice on the bench, cleared his throat. the sound impossibly loud in the silence. It was the first crack in the wall. And Crockett, sensing it, did not waste the opening. The crack in the wall widened with that single sound, a throat clearing. Small and human, yet seismic, in a chamber where silence was the most guarded weapon. Jasmine Crockett saw it. She seized it. "I know you are listening," she said. Not accusing, not begging, but affirming. "And I know listening is not enough." Her words folded the chamber into a kind of forced intimacy, as though each robed figure had been singled out, stripped of the protection of the collective. She pivoted sharply, moving into education, not in abstractions, but in the blunt facts of rulings that had eroded equity in classrooms across the nation. She recalled how court decisions had narrowed the scope of desegregation orders, how districts once monitored by federal oversight were left to slide quietly back into segregation, by housing lines and district zoning, separate but equal, she said, was declared dead. Yet in city after city, school after school, the tomb has been pried open, and the doctrine walks among us in new clothes. The gallery behind her shifted, a few nodding heads visible in the corners of her eye. But she never broke her forward gaze. She spoke of students in her own district, children sitting in classrooms with no air conditioning in Texas heat. While just a few miles away, wealthier schools boasted robotics labs and theater wings. She reminded the court of their own precedents. That education was declared a foundation of citizenship, that equality in the classroom was supposed to be equality in the republic. "If you guard the ballot," she said, "but let the schoolhouse fall, then democracy itself rots from the root." She turned the blade toward healthcare next, tying it to the Affordable Care Act battles and the string of challenges that had reached their chamber. She didn't recite policy points. She told of patients waiting 6 months for appointments, of insulin prices so high that families rationed doses, of rural hospitals closing while legal debates over mandates dragged on. "The law cannot heal the sick," she said softly, "but it can keep them from being abandoned." A judge at the far end of the bench shifted, leaning toward a colleague as though whispering something. Crockett caught the movement but pressed on. She wasn't here for whispers. She was here for the record. Her pacing slowed again, deliberate, heavy. She framed the court not as neutral, not as detached, but as an active participant in the fracture of the nation's fabric. "Your rulings," she said, "are not words, they are budgets in classrooms. They are water in faucets. They are lives prolonged or lives cut short." The temperature of the room seemed to drop. Even the court reporter's keystrokes felt quieter. Then she moved where few dared. The Second Amendment. She invoked Heller, MacDonald, Brune, not in long citations, but in outcomes. She listed the shootings, the grieving families, the towns, forever marked by sirens and vigils. She described a mother who told her that her child now scans every room for exit points, not because of instinct, but because of practice. "The framers wrote of militias," she said, "not classrooms where children learn to barricade doors with desks." The words were heavy, not because of volume, but because they carried the unbearable familiarity of truth. A murmur rose from the gallery, hushed quickly, but not before echoing faintly against the marble walls. Crockett did not acknowledge it. Her focus remained locked on the 9 faces above her. And then she gave them no place to hide. "Every time you interpret that amendment," she said, "you decide whose child gets to grow old. That is not theory, that is arithmetic. That is graves." The silence that followed was a silence of reckoning. No pen scratched, no robe shifted. For the first time, the court seemed motionless, not out of discipline, but out of the gravity of what had been spoken. She let it sit there, the silence itself an answer, before lifting her head slightly, as though preparing to raise the stakes again, because she knew, and they knew, that she was not yet finished.